A man died on the wedding night, seated, smiling, and far too quiet. They blamed the bride's mother, but in Flaxborough, nothing is ever that simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Alone, perhaps, and if everyone points to the same suspect, would you dare to doubt them? Let's begin. The morning after the wedding, the town of Flaxborough awoke in a peculiar silence. It wasn't the gentle hush of a Sunday lie-in, nor the bleary quiet that follows a village fete. It was, rather, the kind of pause that comes before something is acknowledged, the breath between disbelief and declaration. At 7:30, the town's only florist, Miss Chubble, drew back the bolts on her shop door and was met not by the usual clink of the milk float, but by Reverend Hargreaves, pale and perspiring, though the weather was crisp. "She's dead," he said, quite without context, his hand still on the little gate that led to St. Bede's Chapel. Miss Chubble blinked. "Who is?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned and walked back the way he had come, as if whatever errand had drawn him to the florist had been forgotten entirely. Miss Chubble watched him go, her mind already skipping ahead, not to grief or fear, but to the practical matter of whether lilies might be requested again so soon after a wedding. The bride, everyone knew, was named Lydia Callow. Slim, smiling too much, and wearing a borrowed dress from her cousin in Ipswich. The groom was Alan Bright, assistant clerk of the borough council, known mostly for having once used the town's printer to make 30 copies of a menu for his mother's birthday supper. They had married the day before in what had been described, by Mrs. Royle, the butcher's wife, as a slightly overconfident affair. The reception had been held at the Flaxborough Assembly Rooms. There had been sherry, there had been music from a record player someone had wheeled in on a trolley, and there had been a great deal of whispering about the bride's mother, Mrs. Callow, a woman of strong jaw and stronger opinions, who had worn black to the wedding and had been seen muttering sharply at her daughter during the cake-cutting. By 9 o'clock that morning, the news had settled like dust on window-sills. It was not the bride who had died, nor the groom. It was the groom's uncle, Mr. Bernard Bright, a man of immaculate reputation and quiet authority, former councilman, donor to the St. Bede Restoration Fund, and the sort of man whose handshake was firm but not sweaty. He had been found by the maid at the Three Bells Inn, room 4B, where he had stayed after having a little too much trifle and sermon, as Mrs. Royle had put it. But trifle, it appeared, had nothing to do with it. He had been found sitting upright in the wing-back chair beside the window, hands folded neatly. His mouth was slightly open. The police doctor, summoned hastily after the innkeeper, Mrs. Breeze, stopped, shrieking, noted no signs of trauma. But he did note something peculiar. His lips were stained a faint red, but there had been no wine served at the reception. Inspector Purbright received the call at 9:12 a.m. He was halfway through buttering toast and listening to a wireless broadcast about the origin of Yorkshire pudding. His landline, which rarely rang before midday, did so with a stubborn, staccato insistence. Purbright dressed slowly, his mind already sifting. The death of a man like Bernard Bright, polite, punctual, and unfailingly dull, was not the sort of thing one expected to investigate. Yet something in the voice of Sergeant Love on the other end of the telephone, a careful restraint, like a man holding a particularly sharp envelope, made him pause. At the Three Bells, the air was full of the wrong kind of silence, not reverent, but waiting. Purbright greeted Mrs. Breeze, who had re-wrapped her curlers and was now drinking from a sherry glass that definitely did not contain sherry. "He was so calm-looking," she whispered. "Almost smug, if I'm allowed to say so." Purbright examined the body. He did not touch, only observed. The mouth slightly ajar, the faint red tint, the positioning of the hands. So precise it became unnatural, and on the carpet, something small, nearly missed, a single wedding petal, crushed and pink. not from any flower that had been used in the ceremony, according to Miss Chubble's arrangement. Mrs. Callow was questioned, of course, first privately by the innkeeper, who admitted to overhearing raised female voices outside the inn around midnight, and then formally by Sergeant Love, who scribbled down phrases like visible disdain for groom and unaccounted 20 minutes. She said she'd been out walking, alone, to calm herself. She didn't like the man her daughter was marrying, the innkeeper confided to Sergeant Love later, and Mr. Bright was very fond of the boy, said he'd protect him from clutching apron strings. It didn't take long for that remark to drift, like smoke, through the town. At the railway cafe, Mrs. Royal whispered she was always dramatic. You know, sharp round the edges. And she did say she wouldn't let anyone ruin Lydia's life again. Purbright said very little that day. He returned to his station, closed the door, and wrote 3 words in his notebook. Petal. Smug. Alone. And then, beneath them, circled twice. Why the wingback? By evening, the town had collectively decided. It was the bride's mother, and the only question now was whether she had poisoned the man before, during, or after the sherry. But Purbright, sitting quietly in his office with a lukewarm cup of tea, allowed the possibility of something else. Something smaller, sharper, and less expected. He would wait. After all, the petals on the aisle were not red, and yet one was. Inspector Purbright stood in the drawing-room of the Sarn, 3 bells in longer than he needed to. The body had been taken away. The constable had collected statements, and Sergeant Love had returned to the station with all the brisk self-assurance of a man who believed the mystery was, in broad strokes, already solved. But Purbright lingered. The wingback chair was still there, angled slightly toward the window, as if Mr. Bright had hoped to catch the moonlight before he died. A book, The Riddle of the Sands, sat closed on the side table, unread. Purbright reached for it, turned it over in his hands, and then set it down again. The spine was stiff. He stooped slowly, knees protesting in silence, and examined the patch of carpet again. The petal, the crushed one, had been bagged and tagged. But something else caught his eye now, a faint ring on the carpet, not a wine stain, but the shadow of something once placed and removed. Circular. Perhaps a glass. Perhaps not. He made a note in his pocketbook. Then, adjusting his collar, he walked downstairs and out onto the street, where the cool morning air clung like thin cloth. The assembly rooms, still littered with floral remnants and crumpled bunting, had not yet been swept. A lone cleaner with a wide broom moved in deliberate arcs, unconcerned by ceremony. Purbright nodded at him, then made his way to the rear. There was a side door, unlocked, and through it, the corridor led past the coat check and toward the fire exit. Here, he paused. The floor was scuffed from dancing shoes and serving trolleys, but near the door he saw faint traces of something that did not belong. A scuff, deeper than the rest, and beside it, the crushed tail of a paper streamer, smeared faintly with red. Lipstick. He stepped outside. The alley beyond the assembly rooms was narrow and bricked, lined with bins and the lingering odor of old fish. It opened at the far end toward the high street, and opposite, just visible beyond the low wall, was the sign of the 3 Bells Inn. A short walk. Just enough time for someone, in a particular mood, to cool off, or to exact something less theatrical than revenge but more lasting than words. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was composing a report. He looked up when Purbright entered, hopeful. She says she went out walking, couldn't sleep. Mrs. Callow, and the innkeeper places her outside at near midnight. Purbright removed his coat, hung it carefully on the hook, and said nothing. Love pressed on. Strong motive, sir. Bride's mother disapproves. Respected uncle intervenes. Tension all around. And now, Uncle's dead. Poisoning seems likely. Doctors waiting on toxicology. Could be anything, rat poison or sedative in the sherry. But she had opportunity, and she's hardly inconspicuous. Purbright sat, steepled his fingers together, and tilted his head ever so slightly. And yet, he said, there's something too visible about it, like a stage that was prepared for an audience. Sergeant Love blinked. You think someone's framing her? I think, said Purbright, that when a person dies in a manner so neat, in a chair so posed, with his hands folded so precisely, we are meant to assume serenity. But serenity rarely has such dramatic timing, especially not after cake. A silence settled in the room. Outside, the clock tower struck 11. By midday, word had spread. Mrs. Callow had not been arrested, but she had been asked not to leave Flaxborough, which in the eyes of the town was tantamount to being dragged through the streets in chains. She remained in the room she had taken at the Sycamore guest house, across from the post office, and had asked for no visitors. Lydia, her daughter, had refused to speak publicly. The new groom, Alan Bright, had already returned to the town clerk's office, apparently sorting out parking fines and acting as though nothing at all had occurred, according to Miss Cribbs, the office secretary who had offered this observation unprompted to anyone within earshot. Purbright, meanwhile, went to the chemist, not because he suspected anything there, but because Mr. Venn, the chemist, had once served as a quiet compass for public mood. He greeted the inspector with a small nod and gestured toward the weighing scale, which had never once been used, but always polished. Can't say I'm surprised, said Mr. Venn without being asked. The mother always did look like she had murder in her veins. Did she ever purchase anything unusual? Mr. Venn pursed his lips. Oh, she wasn't a customer, never liked modern medicine. Said her nerves were best treated by peppermint bark and disapproval. Purbright smiled faintly. And Mr. Bright? Bernard? Oh, very tidy man. Always bought throat lozenges in even numbers. Never smiled unless you asked him not to. That kind. Purbright thanked him and left. Outside he stood for a long moment beneath the hanging sign of the chemist. A dog barked somewhere down Market Street. A bicycle bell chimed. And in that silence, something came back to him, the remark from the maid at the inn. He looked smug. People rarely looked smug unless they had just won something, or expected to win. He walked slowly to the registrar's office and requested access to the wedding paperwork. There, among the formal declarations and the borrowed pen signatures, was a small note on the reverse of the marriage license, a handwritten amendment initialed by both bride and groom, a clause regarding the joint tenancy of a new property, a cottage on Wisteria Lane. Interesting. The cottage had not been mentioned by anyone, not even the bride's mother, yet it had been signed into agreement the day of the wedding, and the owner, previous at least, had been Bernard Bright. By the time Purbright returned to the station, it was raining. He found Sergeant Love reading through old statements with a highlighter. I think we should speak to the solicitor, Purbright said. Mr. Faversham, he handled Mr. Bright's estate. Love raised a brow. You think it's about money? No, said Purbright quietly. I think it's about approval. The visit to Faversham's office was brief. The man, round-faced and apologetic, revealed, with great reluctance, that Bernard Bright had adjusted his will the week before the wedding. He added a codicil, Faversham explained, dabbing at his temples, to ensure the property went to Alan and Lydia jointly, but with an interesting stipulation. He handed over a typed note. In the event of a divorce within 12 months of marriage, the property shall revert to the estate, and Lydia Callow shall have no claim. Purbright folded the paper slowly. Did Mrs. Callow know of this? I doubt it. It was meant to protect Alan, I believe. Mr. Bright was protective. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, obscuring the cobbles and washing the petals into the gutters. Purbright turned the collar of his coat up and said nothing for a long moment. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the church spire, a second twist arrived. Mrs. Breeze, the innkeeper, returned to the police station, flustered. "I forgot to mention," she said, breathless. "There was someone else near the stairs that night. Not the bride's mother. A man." "Can you describe him?" Love asked, leaning forward. "No," she admitted, "but he was whistling." Purbright looked up. "Whistling?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "A strange little tune, over and over again, just past midnight." He nodded, slowly. "Then I think," said Inspector Purbright, "we may be listening to the wrong silence." At precisely 9:06 the following morning, Inspector Purbright stood outside the Sycamore guest house beneath a sky that couldn't decide whether it was morning or morning. The clouds moved like elderly patrons at a post office queue, slowly, with muttering intent. He had not telephoned ahead. Mrs. Callow opened the door herself. Her eyes were puffy, not with crying but with the fatigue of too many hours spent defending one's dignity. She wore a knitted shawl and a look of weary contempt. "Inspector," she said, and then stepped aside. The parlor was neat, not decorated, arranged. Magazines aligned to the edge of the coffee table, a single vase of plastic peonies standing sentry in the corner. Mrs. Callow sat stiffly and gestured to the opposing armchair with the formality of someone offering a chess match, not a conversation. Purbright did not sit. Instead, he remained standing, hands loosely clasped behind his back. "Mrs. Callow," he said gently, "may I ask, when you went walking, the night Mr. Bright died, did you pass by the assembly rooms again?" She blinked. "Yes. Is that not allowed now?" "Of course. I ask because a witness believes they heard voices. Yours, possibly, and a man's." Mrs. Callow's lips pressed together, not in denial, but in memory. "I don't recall speaking to anyone." Purbright gave her a moment. "But I suppose," she continued, "there might have been someone near the alley, behind the florist, a shadow. I didn't see a face, just humming or whistling, something tuneless." "And you didn't report this?" "I was under the impression I was the only suspect," she replied dryly. A faint smile touched the corners of Purbright's mouth. Not amusement, but recognition. She was not easy to like, and perhaps she did not try to be. But the line between guilt and irritation was often clearer in Flaxborough than in most places. "Would you recognize the tune if you heard it again?" "No," she said, "but I remember how it made me feel. Uneasy, not frightened exactly. Just annoyed." He nodded. "I wonder," he said softly, "if that's exactly what it was meant to do." He left her then, with a promise to remain in touch, and walked down to the assembly rooms once again. A man was affixing a new poster to the display board outside. "Midweek bingo and local cheese tasting." Purbright stepped inside, walked to the far end, and pressed his hand lightly against the fire door's handle. Then he stood, not thinking, listening. Somewhere in the distance, faint but insistent, someone was whistling. It came from the alley. Not tuneful. A rising and falling note, circling on itself like someone polishing a lie. Purbright stepped through. The alley was empty, except for a single discarded cigarette butt, freshly stubbed, still faintly warm. Its brand, imported, French, was not one typically sold in Flaxborough. Certainly not by Mr. Venn the chemist, who had opinions about foreign products and shared them freely. Purbright picked it up with a handkerchief and placed it in his coat pocket. He did not whistle. By midday, he had returned to the station and asked for a list of guests who had attended the wedding reception. He was particularly interested in those who had not stayed the night. Sergeant Love scanned the list. There was a cousin from Lincoln, left before the cake apparently. A Mr. Todd from the bank, went home early with a headache. And someone named Clooney Hemmings. Not local. Purbright looked up. Clooney Hemmings? Yes, +1. But no one seems to recall the +1, and there's no address listed. Strange. Purbright made a note. Hemmings, he murmured, is a solicitor, isn't he? Love nodded. Property specialist. Once worked under Mr. Bright, in fact. Ah, Purbright said. Then perhaps he returned the favor. An hour later, Purbright found himself standing in Clooney Hemmings' office. The man was thin, perspiring, and wore a tie patterned with foxes, all running in the same direction. I only stayed for the ceremony, Hemmings said. Didn't much care for receptions. Too much punch and politics. Why? Your guest. Who was he? She, said Hemmings, a little too quickly. Friend of a friend. I've no idea where she went. We didn't arrive together, met her there. Purbright tilted his head. And did she speak with Mr. Bright? No idea, perhaps. I wasn't watching. Is this relevant? That's yet to be determined. Hemmings shifted. His fingers tapped the desk in nervous syncopation. It was the kind of tapping a man does when rehearsing a lie he hasn't decided to use yet. Back in his office, Purbright paced. He had a wedding guest with no name. He had a whistler no one could identify, and he had a chair, a wingback, in which a man had died with lipstick-stained lips and folded hands. He had a petal no one had ordered, a codicil that punished divorce, and a mother whose disdain had become its own form of public currency. But something didn't add up. Sir, Sergeant Love called from the hall. You've got a visitor. Purbright turned. In the doorway stood Lydia. Her hair was pinned too tightly, her dress far too formal for a casual visit, and her eyes, though not red, carried the hollow shine of someone who hadn't blinked properly in 24 hours. I want to speak, she said. Purbright nodded and gestured to the chair opposite. She did not sit. Instead, she remained standing and said, I think my husband's hiding something. Purbright didn't move. About the death? About the cottage, she said. We were never going to live there, but the paperwork, yes, it was signed, because Alan said Bernard would only give us the house if it was in both our names, but he told me, the day before the wedding, that he'd already agreed to sell it, quietly, to a buyer in cash, through someone he knew. Who? I don't know. He wouldn't tell me, said it would settle a debt. But Bernard found out. That's why they argued. I saw them, just behind the florist. He was furious, said Alan was ungrateful, that the house was meant to be a gift, not a sale. And then? Alan walked away, and Bernard looked strange, like someone who'd realized he'd made a mistake giving something to the wrong person. She swallowed. I'm not saying Alan killed him. I don't know what happened. But he hasn't mentioned the argument to anyone, and that frightens me. Purbright stood now, slowly. Thank you, he said. That's very helpful. She nodded and left. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky still sagged, heavy with thought. That night, Purbright sat in the dark of his office. Not reading, just listening. Somewhere in the records, someone would remember the tune, a song, a jingle, something old and out of place. He lifted the cigarette stub from his coat pocket and turned it in the light. French tobacco. Too expensive for anyone in Flaxborough. Too specific to be coincidence. He wrote a name in his notebook. Not a suspect yet. Just a direction. Clooney Hemmings. And then, beneath it, in darker ink, +1 or +none. It was a Wednesday morning that could not decide whether to drizzle or sulk. Flaxborough's streets shimmered faintly from an overnight damp, and the scent of wet brick clung to the town like a half-forgotten tune. Inspector Purbright arrived at the assembly rooms not because he expected evidence to reappear, but because sometimes in Flaxborough, truth had the habit of leaving fingerprints not on surfaces, but on atmospheres. The hall stood empty now. The flowers had been cleared, the cake crumbs swept, but a peculiar tension still lingered in the parquet flooring, as though the room itself remembered something it was not supposed to. Purbright walked slowly to the rear, where the fire door opened onto the alley, and stood once more beneath the narrow awning, whistling. Not present now, but he could hear the echo of it in his mind, tuneless, rising and falling without rhythm or melody. It wasn't a song, it was a signal, a form of distraction. Someone had been there that night, someone who needed to confuse or delay or mislead, and it hadn't been Mrs. Callow. It was time, he thought, to visit Mr. Clooney Hemmings again, this time without politeness. Hemmings's office was as it had been, lined with ledgers, smelling faintly of mint and cheap ink. The man himself looked flustered, a permanent condition, it seemed. "I already told you," he began, as Purbright entered, "I didn't really know her. You knew her well enough to invite her to a wedding." Hemmings gave a short, hollow laugh. "You know how these things are, Inspector. She was a friend of someone I met at a dinner months ago. We'd spoken twice. I thought she might enjoy the event." "Her name?" "I don't recall." Purbright's gaze did not waver. "I think you do." Hemmings fidgeted. His fingers picked at the edge of his desk blotter, rolling the corner into a curl. "She called herself Simone." "Simone what?" "Didn't say." "Do you always bring nameless guests to family weddings?" "She wasn't a guest of mine," Hemmings snapped, and then instantly regretted it. Purbright waited. "I mean," Hemmings continued weakly, "she came at my invitation, yes, but she had other reasons for attending, I believe." "Such as?" "I'm not sure. She seemed more interested in the groom than the festivities." "Interested how?" Hemmings blinked. "She asked questions about the house, the one Bernard was giving them." Purbright tilted his head slightly. "Did she tell you how she knew about the house?" "Number only that the transaction might not go as planned." A pause. "She said Alan was in over his head." Purbright left with a faint nod and the air of a man who had heard far more than had been said. Outside, he stopped at the corner by the baker's and took out his notebook. "Simone, unknown surname. French cigarettes. Knows about house. Interested in Alan. And then, below that, not a guest. A lever." Back at the station, Sergeant Love looked up from the reception desk. "Message from Mrs. Callow," he said. "She says she remembered something." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "She says she heard the whistling again." "When?" "Last night. Outside her guest house. Just a few notes." Then silence. That, thought Purbright, was not coincidence. It was a message. Mrs. Callow, when questioned, was sharper than ever. "It wasn't the same pattern," she said. "Not quite. But similar. Something about it was deliberate. Just loud enough to hear. Just long enough to disturb." "Did you see anyone?" There was a smell. Something foreign, sharp, like perfume and cloves." Purbright nodded slowly. "What kind of perfume?" "The sort worn by people who want to be noticed or remembered." "Would you recognize it again?" Mrs. Callow's eyes narrowed. "I don't forget the smell of being threatened." Purbright spent the afternoon examining guest records at the Three Bells Inn. The register was handwritten, the pages stiff with years of quiet secrets. No Simone had been signed in. No woman matching that description had taken a room. But there was one oddity. Room 2C, unoccupied, according to the record. Yet the housekeeper had changed the linens the next morning. "I thought someone had slipped in," she admitted when asked. The bed was mussed, mirror smudged, a faint scent of perfume. "Any belongings?" "Number." but the window was unlatched from the inside. How often is that room left unlocked? Never. Purbright took note. A ghost guest, a woman who came with no surname, left no record and vanished before breakfast, but left her scent behind. And a noise. By twilight, the inspector found himself walking the path between the assembly rooms and the inn for the 4th time. It was not the path of evidence. It was the path of implication. He paused where the alley narrowed, where the whistling had been heard. He stood in the dim, just under the broken lamplight, and thought. The chair, the folded hands, the lipstick-stained lips. Bernard Bright had not simply died. He had been displayed, and that meant something. He wrote a phrase in his notebook. Someone wanted it to look like peace. But behind that quiet, someone had placed violence and shame. That evening, Purbright made a quiet visit to the cottage on Wisteria Lane, the one Bernard Bright had supposedly gifted to the newlyweds. The property was empty, windows curtained, no cars. But the front gate had been recently opened, the hinges freshly oiled. He stepped onto the porch and rang the bell. No answer. He waited, then circled around back where the small conservatory sat half-shrouded in ivy. The door was open. Inside, dust marked the furniture, except one chair, recently wiped. A glass sat on the table, still holding the outline of a woman's lipstick, and next to it, folded neatly, a letter. Typed. Unsigned. You promised discretion. The house was meant to be settled before the wedding. If you do not complete the payment, your career will be as dead as your uncle. Purbright exhaled through his nose. The threat was not aimed at Mrs. Callow. It was aimed at Alan, and it had come from someone who used lipstick, French cigarettes, and whistled without music. Back at the station, he laid the letter before Sergeant Love. Well, Love said, that clears her, doesn't it? Mrs. Callow. She wouldn't use this kind of leverage. No, said Purbright, but someone would, if they stood to lose everything. Alan, possibly, but he's not smart enough to arrange the staging. Then who? Purbright closed his notebook and looked toward the window, where the town was beginning to turn its lights on, one by one, as though blinking slowly awake. I don't know yet, he said, but I know this much. The person who killed Bernard Bright didn't want to kill him out of rage or panic. He turned back to Love. They killed him out of strategy. That night at precisely 11, the telephone at the station rang. It was the constable on overnight patrol, breathless. There's been another whistling, sir. Behind the assembly rooms again, only this time... Yes? This time someone left a scarf on the fire escape. Silk. French. Any sign of them? Gone by the time I got there. Purbright closed his eyes. Not out of fatigue, but calculation. He stood, reached for his coat, and said quietly, have Mrs. Callow escorted home and put someone outside her door. Why? Because the killer thinks she still matters. Inspector Purbright examined the scarf in the quiet of his office, late in the evening. The silk was of a fine, whisper-thin quality, the kind not found in Flaxborough shops, unless one counted the dusty window display at Madame Dufresne's Continental Boutique, which had sold exactly 3 garments since 1963. The pattern on the scarf was muted, autumnal leaves in ochre and gold, with a faded tag stitched into one corner, Montmartre, Lyon. French, like the cigarettes, like the perfume, like the accent the mystery guest had not used, but perhaps wanted people to imagine afterward. He turned it over gently, laying it across the desk blotter like a piece of evidence in a church service. It was a message, not a mistake. To drop a scarf, to whistle again, near the same alley, near the same scene, was not carelessness. It was choreography. Purbright picked up the telephone and dialed the guest house. Sycamore Guest House, came the voice of the landlady, as tired as her curtains. "Inspector Purbright here. Has Mrs. Callow returned to her room?" "Yes. I heard her come in, not 20 minutes ago. Has she received any calls?" A pause. "One, I believe. Didn't speak long. Just said wrong number and hung up." Wrong number, Purbright thought, had a peculiar ring in Flaxborough. It often meant someone had said too little, or far too much. He replaced the receiver gently and turned to the window. Outside, Flaxborough was turning in for the night. Lights dimmed one by one, curtains pulled. Even the milk bottles on porches seemed to stand more solemnly after dark. He returned to the letter, the one found at the cottage. "You promised discretion." It wasn't signed, and it wasn't personal in tone. No emotional residue, no careless insult or wounded plea. Businesslike, and that, in its own way, was more chilling. Someone had spoken to Alan Bright. Someone had planned to profit from the sale of the cottage before the wedding, and someone had found Bernard Bright inconvenient to that arrangement. But whoever had killed him had wanted something else to be blamed, and in Flaxborough nothing served as a better distraction than a mother's disapproval. The following morning, Purbright arrived at the town council building, a red-bricked institution that managed somehow to smell of both floor polish and mild panic. Alan Bright's desk was in the far corner, by a window overlooking a line of bins and a wilting hydrangea bush. Alan looked up, startled. He had the expression of a man who had just been asked to count aloud in church. "Inspector," he said, standing awkwardly, "I didn't expect— no, I imagine you didn't." Purbright remained standing. "May I ask whether your late uncle had any keys in his possession when he was found?" "Keys?" Alan blinked. "Yes. I mean, I assume so. He always carried them." "And did he ever lend them out?" "Not to me." Purbright reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small evidence bag. Inside was a single cottage key, found by the local constable tucked beneath the back porch mat of Wisteria Lane the night before. "We found this key hidden," he said, "and it matches the set removed from your uncle's personal drawer after his death. It had been separated, and it had been recently cleaned." Alan paled. I don't know anything about that." "Then perhaps you can explain why the cottage was entered after the wedding." Alan swallowed. "It was supposed to be a surprise for Lydia, a honeymoon night. I arranged for the bed to be made up. But we never got there. She wasn't feeling well." "And did you ask anyone else to enter the cottage?" No, wait. Maybe. I gave Clooney Hemmings the extra key. To handle the documents, that's all." Purbright's expression did not change. "Mr. Hemmings," he said, "claims no knowledge of that arrangement." Alan's mouth opened, then shut again. His fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. "Did you tell your uncle you planned to sell the property?" Alan hesitated. "Yes, eventually." "Before or after he made the codicil to the will?" "After." "Then you understand how that might have displeased him." Alan sat very still, a man rehearsing reasons, calculating their weight. "I didn't kill him." Purbright didn't respond. Instead he asked, "Do you know a woman named Simone?" "No." "She attended the wedding, sat near the rear, left early, smoked French cigarettes, possibly left a scarf in the alleyway." Alan blinked rapidly. There were a lot of people at the wedding. Lydia invited most of them. "Would you recognize her face?" I don't know." "That's unfortunate," said Purbright, "because she knew yours." An hour later, Purbright walked through the stone arches of the town library, a place so quiet it seemed to hum. The local paper, the Flaxborough Gazette, had recently digitized its archives, but the old clippings were still kept in binders under the supervision of Miss Drypole, the town's most formidable librarian. "I'm looking," he told her, "for any mention of Mr. Clooney Hemmings and foreign property dealings, preferably quiet ones." Miss Drypole, who considered gossip to be a betrayal of print, nonetheless directed him to a brown volume marked Legal Notices, 1959 to 1979. Within it, tucked beside a forgotten boundary dispute and an article on sheep-dipping regulations, was a small advert. Private buyer seeks discreet transfer of countryside property. Legal agent C. Hemmings, Flaxborough. The date was 3 weeks before the wedding, and beneath it a single phone number, listed as belonging to Madame S. Laval. Laval. Lyon. Simone. He closed the binder slowly. Hemmings had lied. The guest hadn't just been a friend of a friend. She was the buyer, and Bernard Bright had likely found out. The night of the reception, the moment his precious gift had been turned into cash. But it wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Purbright stood once more outside Hemmings's office, this time without knocking. He entered. The solicitor was alone, his collar unbuttoned, his hands twitching. "You met her in Lyon," Purbright said flatly. Hemmings didn't answer. "She was your client. You were handling the transfer of the cottage through unofficial channels. A cash sale, off the books, no registry until post-marriage. And when Bernard objected, you, or someone on your behalf, removed the problem." Hemmings rose halfway from his chair. "I didn't kill anyone. I haven't accused you of that." Hemmings sat again. Slowly. "But you knew," said Purbright, "that if someone did kill Bernard, your client would benefit. The sale could go through, the scandal would be covered by outrage, and suspicion would settle on the bride's mother, the woman everyone already disliked." He pulled the scarf from his pocket. This was dropped deliberately, as was the petal, as were the whispers. She was meant to look vindictive. Hemmings's mouth twitched, but someone underestimated her. Purbright stepped forward. "And overestimated you." He turned to leave. But at the door, he paused. "Simone Laval is not in Flaxborough anymore, is she?" "No." "Did she kill him?" Hemmings hesitated. "I don't know. I don't think so." Purbright nodded once. "That's a pity," he said. And he left. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered on and Flaxborough wrapped itself once more in the warmth of its own routines, Inspector Purbright returned to the Three Bells Inn and stood before the wing-back chair. The room had been tidied, the carpet vacuumed, but the air still remembered. Someone had sat there, folded the hands, wiped the glass, painted the lips, left the scarf, and walked away, unseen. But not undetected. Purbright looked out the window. Somewhere the killer had closed the door behind them, but he had his hand on the handle now, and the next knock would not be so polite. Flaxborough was a town of predictable mornings. The paper boy delivered late, the milkman delivered early, and the secrets, if they came at all, came not with sirens or screams, but with a polite knock at the back door, a knock no one admitted to hearing until it had already been answered. Inspector Purbright stood outside the station just after sunrise, sipping tea from a paper cup that had once held paste. The taste was faintly of glue. He didn't mind. He was thinking. Simone Laval was gone. Clooney Hemmings was lying. Alan Bright was hiding. And Bernard Bright, Flaxborough's most respected man, was dead in a chair that someone had rearranged to look like peace. But if peace had truly been the goal, why the lipstick? Why the petal? Why the whistling? Someone had been performing. And performance in Flaxborough was rarely for an audience of one. Purbright turned and walked back into the station, where Sergeant Love was flipping through the previous night's reports with the speed of someone hoping not to find anything new. "Morning, sir. You're early." "Am I?" Purbright asked absently, removing his hat. "Or is the case late?" Love blinked. Purbright gestured for him to follow. "We're going to the cottage." "The Wisteria Lane place?" "No," Purbright said. "The other cottage." The address was in a small notebook Purbright had kept in his desk. A second property, one never mentioned in his will. A place registered under the name of a former housekeeper, now long deceased. Quietly held, possibly forgotten, possibly not. The cottage sat on the edge of town, tucked behind a disused railway line and surrounded by overgrown hedges that had developed their own ecosystem. A rusted gate leaned inward as if bowing to intruders. Purbright opened it and walked the path without speaking. The door was locked, but the key, one of the set found on Bernard, fit smoothly. Inside, the air was stale with neglect, but not abandonment. There was a kettle still plugged in, a tin of biscuits missing its lid, curtains that had been drawn recently. "Someone's been using this," Love said. Purbright nodded. "Not living in it. Just waiting." They moved room to room. The front sitting room contained nothing of note. The kitchen had no new supplies. But in the small back bedroom, they found a handbag. Not hidden, simply resting on the chair as though its owner had just stepped into the garden. Inside, French cigarettes, a lipstick, plum rose, a train ticket stub from 2 days before, London to Flaxborough, one way, and a small folded card. "Room 2C reserved. Do not log. Clooney will pay balance." Love exhaled through his nose. "She was staying here," Purbright nodded. "But someone still made sure her presence vanished from the records." "Clooney? Possibly. But who arranged the room?" He turned the card over. "No name. Just an embossed letterhead. Charnwood Property and Legal Services. A firm in London, one with no branch in Flaxborough." They returned to the station just after 10. Purbright spent an hour on the telephone, most of it listening. When he hung up, he called Love in. "Charnwood confirms she was their client," he said. "Simone Laval. Real name, Sylvie Benoit. Former translator, worked occasionally on cross-border property sales. Criminal record? Number, but she's been investigated twice. Both times for suspected fraud. Both times dropped due to lack of evidence. And now she's gone." Purbright tapped his fingers on the desk. "Number, she's here. Or was. But she's being protected. By who? By someone who fears what she might reveal." He stood. "Fetch Mr. Alan Bright." The younger Bright arrived with the sluggishness of someone summoned to their own inquest. He sat with hands pressed between his knees, eyes flicking toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Purbright offered him a cup of tea. He declined. "Alan," Purbright said calmly, "we've found the woman." Alan didn't react. "Her real name is Sylvie Benoit. She's not a friend of Clooney's. She's not even from Lyon. She lives in Kent. She's been part of at least 2 previous schemes involving estate manipulation." "I didn't know that." "Number, but you did know that the sale of the cottage wasn't legal, that it was being handled privately, that your uncle had already expressed concern." Alan swallowed. "I needed the money." "What for?" There was a long silence. Then, with a sigh so quiet it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room, Alan answered, "Debt." "To whom?" "I don't know his real name. Just a man who came to see me at the club last year. Said he'd heard I was ambitious." Purbright nodded slowly. "Let me guess. He offered to clear your debts in exchange for certain assets." Alan looked down. "I was desperate. Lydia didn't know. Her mother wouldn't have allowed the wedding if she suspected. The cottage was the only thing I had worth anything. And when Bernard found out, he threatened to cancel the transfer. Said he'd change the will again." "Did you tell Sylvie?" Alan hesitated. "I didn't have to. She was there. She heard him. They argued behind the florist." Purbright's gaze sharpened. "And that night did she leave with you?" "Number, she said she'd handle it." "I thought she meant she'd talk to him. Convince him. I didn't know." He stopped. "You didn't know she'd kill him?" Purbright finished. Alan gave a faint, miserable nod. I didn't think she'd do anything serious. I thought she just wanted her money. That afternoon, Purbright returned to the Three Bells. Room 2C had been cleaned, the window left open, but beneath the sill, behind the curtain, was a tiny smudge of lipstick, plum rose, and, lodged in the radiator grill, a thin gold earring, too fine for Flaxborough, too careless for Simone. She'd left in a hurry, but not before ensuring the scene with Bernard looked as clean as possible. She had been the last to see him, had given him wine, had folded his hands, had placed the kiss that would never be noticed, unless one knew how to look for artifice disguised as affection. She wanted the scene to appear domestic, gentle, blameless. She wanted to stage grief. But she forgot one thing. In Flaxborough, nothing quiet stays that quiet. Later that evening, Purbright sat alone in his office. He placed the scarf beside the letter, beside the earring, beside the card. A timeline unfolded. Simone, Sylvie, arrives 2 days before the wedding. She poses as Hemmings's guest. She meets Alan, arranges the cottage deal. Bernard objects. She overhears. That night she poisons his wine, possibly with something subtle. She folds his hands, places him in the wingback, wipes the glass, drops a flower petal, adds lipstick, disappears. Hemmings removes her name from the register, and the town looks the other way. He stood and walked to the window, watching the clouds roll in. The arrest would come later, not tonight, but soon. And in the end, the real motive had never been greed or vengeance. It had been timing. A wedding was the perfect distraction, and a mother's reputation the perfect disguise. But the silence had been too clean. And in Flaxborough, even the cleanest crimes left muddy shoes. The next morning brought with it a low fog that clung to the cobbles like gossip to a sewing circle. Flaxborough's streets were blurred at the edges, as though the town itself was unsure whether to reveal what it knew. Inspector Purbright, however, had no such hesitation. He had risen before dawn, dressed with a precision that suggested both ritual and resolve, and walked, slowly, deliberately, to the home of Clooney Hemmings. It was a neat little bungalow, flanked by overfed hydrangeas and guarded by a cat who appeared to consider the inspector's approach a personal offense. Purbright knocked once, then stepped back. The door opened slowly. Hemmings stood in his dressing gown, unshaven, his face flushed as though the night had either not ended or had ended too late. "Inspector," he said with a forced smile, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "An arrest warrant," Purbright replied mildly. "Though not, I should say, for you." Hemmings blinked. "She's gone," he said. "You won't find her." Purbright nodded. "I know, but I'm not here for Sylvie Benoit. I'm here for the man who helped her disappear." The color left Hemmings' face with the speed of a drawn curtain. "I didn't—" "You altered the guest book," Purbright interrupted gently. "You paid the innkeeper in cash, twice, to leave her name out of the ledger. You handled the draft contract for the illegal cottage sale, and you arranged for a private taxi to take her to the train station the morning after Bernard's death." Hemmings opened his mouth, then shut it again. "I didn't kill him," he said finally, and with more truth than protest. "No," Purbright said. "You just made it easier for the person who did." Back at the station, Purbright watched as Hemmings was led to an interview room, the door shutting behind him with a quietness that somehow seemed louder than any slam. Sergeant Love stepped in from the hallway, holding a clipboard. "Did you see this?" he asked. "Report from the railguard." Purbright took the sheet and scanned it. Sylvie Benoit had indeed boarded a train the morning after the wedding, but not alone. She had been seen speaking with a man on the platform, someone who appeared to be calm, respectful, and carrying a briefcase. Not Alan, not Hemmings, someone else. "Did she say anything?" Purbright asked. Love nodded. The guard remembers her saying, "Tell him not to make the call yet, not until they arrest her." Purbright frowned. "Her," he repeated. "Not him." The implication was clear. They had always assumed Sylvie's escape had been timed to Alan's benefit. But what if it had been meant to cover someone else entirely? By late afternoon, the fog had lifted, and with it, so had a layer of certainty. Purbright sat in his office, staring not at papers, but at people, a mental image of them arranged like chess pieces. Bernard Bright, dead in a chair, with dignity applied like makeup. Sylvie Benoit, vanished. Clooney Hemmings, detained. Alan Bright, debt-ridden and dull, but no killer. Mrs. Callow, scowling, sharp, innocent. Lydia, frightened, honest. But there was still one piece that had not moved. One name that had hovered just outside suspicion, never questioned, never doubted. Reverend Hargreaves. He was the one who discovered the body. Or rather, reported the body. He had arrived at the florist's door before anyone else had known something was wrong. He had been calm, concerned, present, too present. The Reverend lived in a modest vicarage beside St. Bede's, a building so symmetrical it seemed to apologize for existing. Purbright walked the path to the door and rang the bell with a deliberate hand. The Reverend opened it himself, still in collar, his face serene. "Inspector," he said pleasantly. "A pastoral call?" "A civic one," Purbright replied. "Might I come in?" "Of course." The vicarage smelled of old hymnals and furniture polish. A clock ticked somewhere beyond the hallway. "I wanted to ask," Purbright said once seated, "about the morning you found Bernard Bright's body. You said you were on your way to the florist's?" "Yes," Hargreaves nodded. "I had promised to pick up flowers for the communion table. Miss Chubble was expecting me." "At 7:30? "Well, yes. I prefer to get things done early." Very civic-minded. Purbright waited a beat. "Had you seen Mr. Bright the night before?" "No," the Reverend said too quickly. "Not at the reception?" "I left early." "Did anyone see you leave?" Hargreaves hesitated. "I don't keep an account of my movements, Inspector." "Number, but others might." The Reverend's face tightened, just slightly. "You don't suspect me of anything?" "I suspect," Purbright said calmly, "that someone entered the Three Bells Inn after the reception, before the body was found. Someone who wanted to arrange the scene, and someone who could do so without raising alarm." "And you think that was me?" "I think," Purbright said, "that Bernard Bright knew something about a member of his church that he wasn't meant to know. I think he confronted you with it, and I think you, realizing what that information could do, decided to remove the risk." Silence. "Bernard was a proud man," Hargreaves said finally. "He didn't like people deviating from his expectations." "So you drugged him?" "No." "Then how did he die?" The Reverend stood. "I'm not answering that." Purbright rose as well. "Then I'll find out." He paused at the door. "You didn't whistle, did you?" Hargreaves looked confused. "Whistle?" "Behind the assembly rooms, late at night." "No," the Reverend said. "I've always had poor breath control." Purbright nodded faintly, then left. Outside, the sun had begun its descent. Sergeant Love was waiting in the car. "Well?" he asked. "Too smooth," Purbright muttered. "He's hiding something, but not the murder." "Then who whistled?" Purbright looked across the green, where a group of children played hopscotch on faded chalk squares. "Someone who knew the wedding would cloud everything," he said. "Someone who knew exactly how to push suspicion where it would stick." "Who?" Purbright tapped his notebook. "Someone who didn't exist back at the station." He returned to the guest book. "Room 2C. Reserved. By someone. Not Sylvie, not Clooney, not the Reverend. But what if there had been no Simone Laval at all? What if Sylvie Benoit was only ever known by that name through others? What if she had never given it? What if the name, the French touches, the scarf, the cigarettes, had all been part of the story, to make her seem real, visible, foreign, convenient? Because if she was a stranger, then no one in Flaxborough would question her vanishing, and the only person who ever claimed to meet her was Clooney Hemmings. Purbright closed his eyes and remembered the quote from the florist. There was a woman, with dark hair, quiet. She looked like she didn't want to be remembered. Not foreign, not flirtatious, not even memorable, but present, which meant she was from Flaxborough. She hadn't come here. She had always been here. Someone ordinary, someone overlooked, someone like... He stood suddenly and spoke just one name. Miss Cribbs. Miss Cribbs had been the Borough Council Secretary for 19 years, 3 months, and, as she often said with pinched pride, only one Friday off in that entire stretch, and that was due to a flooded kettle. She was a woman of resolute hairstyle, woolen cardigans no season could challenge, and the unnerving ability to recall, without hesitation, the contents of every post-it note ever stuck on a town clerk's desk. She was also, by all accounts, invisible. Not literally, of course. She was present in every staff photo, every audit meeting, and every Monday's second coffee round. But she passed through conversations like wallpaper, acknowledged but never examined. And that, Purbright thought, made her dangerous. He arrived at the council building just before lunch. Inside, the smell of stale carpet and administrative dread hung in the air. Miss Cribbs was at her usual post, her fingers clacking away at a typewriter that had outlived 3 mayors and a small mouse infestation. She looked up, polite but blank. "Inspector." "Again?" "Miss Cribbs," he said warmly. "I'd like a word. If you've a moment." She blinked once. "Of course. Shall we use the mayor's meeting room?" "Let's." She rose, smoothed her skirt, and led him down the corridor with the efficiency of someone who had memorized both every corridor and every reason for someone walking down them. Inside the meeting room, a dismal square with a fake ficus and a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II looking vaguely surprised. Miss Cribbs gestured to a chair. She remained standing. "You've been busy," she said with quiet precision. "So I gather from Mr. Bright's long absences and the sudden presence of a constable at the guest house." "I'm afraid it's been a rather tangled matter," Purbright said. She inclined her head. "That's Flaxborough, full of thread and no needles." He smiled. "I have just a few questions. Routine, really." "Of course." "You were at the wedding?" "Yes." "And the reception?" "I stayed until the speeches. Left before the cake." "I don't like fondant." "Quite. Did you know Sylvie Benoit?" A pause. "The first." "No," she said, "though I heard the name mentioned by Mr. Hemmings." "Did you ever meet her?" "No." "Did you ever see her?" "No." Purbright nodded. "It's funny. Inspector." "Everyone describes her differently." Hemmings said she had an accent. Allen said she didn't. The florist said she was quiet. The railguard said she looked local. Miss Cribbs said nothing. But no one saw her and remembered her well, except one person. A long pause now. "You," Purbright said softly. Miss Cribbs did not move. Her hands remained folded before her like a chapel book. "Forgive me," she said eventually. "But how would I have known her?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced the folded scarf, the one left near the alley. "Do you recognize this?" She looked down at it. "I do not." "That's strange," Purbright said, "because we found a photograph in Hemmings' files, a group shot. Legal conference 3 years ago. You're in the back row wearing this exact scarf." She didn't blink. "I have several. This one has a tear in the seam," he continued. "Same place, same pattern, same woman." He leaned forward slightly. "There never was a Sylvie Benoit, was there?" She did not reply. You were Sylvie. You played her, wore perfume, smoked foreign cigarettes, changed your hair, wore lipstick you normally wouldn't, left clues that pointed away from here, from Flaxborough, from you. Still no reply. Because you knew, Purbright said, that no one would suspect Miss Cribbs, the secretary. No one ever does. But everyone remembers the Frenchwoman who never left a surname. She looked up at him now, her face calm. Still, but there was a shift behind her eyes. Not panic, not even fear. Relief. I didn't mean for him to die, she said softly. Purbright sat back. I thought he'd just sleep. The confession came like a tide, not crashing but washing in slow and inevitable. Miss Cribbs had known Bernard Bright for years. She had typed his reports, corrected his grammar, fetched his tea, remembered his birthdays. She had watched him become the center of every room he entered, and watched also how he'd spoken to Alan with a certain indulgent cruelty, the kind that looked like mentorship from the outside and like quiet destruction from within. She had seen the paperwork, the codicil, had known that Alan would be trapped, that Lydia would be trapped, that Mrs. Callow, brittle as she was, would be painted as the villain in any family row. And one day, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of something older, Miss Cribbs had done something she'd never done before. She interfered. I thought I could convince him, she said. I waited outside the inn. I had wine. I told him we should talk just for a moment. He wasn't pleased to see me. Said it was highly inappropriate. So you drugged him? Purbright said gently. She nodded. Just a small dose, something mild. Just to quiet him. I thought he'd pass out, wake up embarrassed, think he'd drunk too much. But he died. I left the room. I didn't even notice he'd stopped breathing. I didn't know, not until the morning when I heard he'd been found. So you cleaned the scene? I returned before anyone was up. I folded his hands. I wiped the glass. I left the scarf because I wanted them to suspect someone else, someone foreign, someone dramatic, someone no one would trace to you. She gave a tiny smile. And it worked. Purbright was quiet a long moment. Why? Miss Cribbs took a breath that sounded like it had waited 20 years. Because I loved him, once, long ago, before he became what he became, before the town made him into something closed. He had sharp edges, Inspector. He cut everyone even when he meant to polish. And so you thought, what? I thought if he were gone, the Bright family would be free. Lydia, even Alan. Mrs. Callow might be rude, but she would have protected her daughter. But Bernard, he wrapped everything in chains and called it tradition. Purbright stood. You'll make a full statement. She nodded. I already have. He turned to the door. Miss Cribbs. Yes? You shouldn't have tried to be someone else. She gave a smile so small it could have fit inside a postage stamp. I didn't, she said. I was always invisible. Sylvie was the first time anyone ever looked. That night, Flaxborough settled once more into its old familiar rhythm. The milkman made notes. The paperboy wore gloves. And Inspector Purbright returned to the station where the quiet was comfortable, like a worn coat. Sergeant Love was filling out the final charge sheet. She'll go quietly, he said. She's always gone quietly, Purbright replied. And Alan, not guilty, foolish, but not cruel. And Hemmings. He'll face obstruction charges and a lifelong ban from creative accounting. Love tapped the typewriter keys, then paused. Sir. Yes? What tipped it? That it was her. Purbright looked toward the window, where the light from the church tower cut faintly across the rooftops. She was the only one, he said, who didn't need to invent a stranger to tell a story. Flaxborough returned to itself the next day. The wedding photos were developed, the flowers were replaced. And somewhere in the town council files, Miss Cribbs's name remained. Quiet, dutiful, misfiled in the margins of someone else's life. But Purbright, back at his desk with tea that no longer tasted of glue, made one small note in his diary. The most dangerous thing in a quiet town is a quiet woman with time. The news of Miss Cribb's arrest moved through Flaxborough like a foghorn in a chapel, loud, unexpected, and slightly scandalous. Not because it involved a death. The town had, over time, developed a certain philosophical calm about those. But because it involved Miss Cribbs, the woman who corrected apostrophes in council notices, the woman who reminded Alderman Clegg of his own birthday, the woman who had once memorized a seating chart for the Christmas luncheon in case of a snow delay. Her arrest was not discussed loudly. It was whispered, as though saying it plainly might undo reality, as though the town might be held complicit if the syllables escaped too freely. Purbright understood. Small towns weren't built on laws, they were built on expectations, and Miss Cribbs had never once failed to meet them. Until she had. That morning, he called Lydia to the station, not for questioning, not exactly, but because she was in all this, the one who had not yet been asked what she thought. She arrived wearing a coat that didn't suit her, and a face that didn't belong to someone who had been a bride just days ago. She looked older, not in years, but in knowing. "Thank you for coming," Purbright said, guiding her gently into his office. "I suppose I should be grateful I haven't been arrested," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fatigue. "You haven't committed any crime, Mrs. Bright." She gave a soft snort. "Then I must be the only one who hasn't." Purbright didn't smile. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." She folded her hands in her lap. "All right. Did you know Miss Cribbs well?" "Not especially," she replied. "She was always polite. Gave me a card for the wedding. Typed the place cards, I think. Never really said much." "And your mother?" "Oh," Lydia exhaled. "Mum didn't trust her. Said she had that nosy stillness that meant trouble." She wasn't wrong. Lydia looked down. "She killed Bernard?" "Yes." "Why?" "She says it was to free you, from your uncle's control, from the house, from the terms of the will." Lydia was silent for a long time. "Then, that's not love. That's arrangement." "She believed it was justice." Lydia shook her head slowly. "Bernard wasn't cruel," she said. "He was controlling, but not cruel. He thought he knew best. He didn't understand compromise." Purbright watched her carefully. "I'm sorry you had to carry so much, Mrs. Bright." She looked up at him now. And for the first time her voice cracked, just slightly. "I wasn't afraid of Bernard, Inspector. I was afraid of being stuck, between him and my mother, between Alan and the lies, between being a daughter and a wife and a pawn, and a performance." She blinked quickly, then laughed. A single breath. Miss Cribbs thought she was helping. She thought removing one piece would set the whole board free. But instead, Purbright said gently, it just turned the board over. Lydia nodded. "I wanted to leave the morning after the wedding," she whispered. "But then Bernard died, and everything changed. I had to smile, had to pretend, because that's what brides do. We keep smiling until no one asks what it's costing us." After she left, Purbright sat for some time in silence. The wind moved past the window in long, tired sighs. He looked at the clock, then, almost unwillingly, at the wedding photo, the one the council photographer had taken and later donated to the station for archival continuity. Everyone in it looked posed, because they were. He stared at Miss Cribb's face in the corner, unsmiling, upright, and, now that he looked again, watching. That evening, just before the dusk, he walked to the church. Reverend Hargreaves was in the back garden, pruning roses with a care that suggested penance rather than hobby. "Inspector," he said without looking up. "Come for confession?" "No, thank you," Purbright replied. "Just a question." Hargreaves snipped a Browning stem and set it aside. "Go on, then. Did you know about Miss Cribbs and Bernard?" The shears paused mid-air. "I suspected something." "Why didn't you say so?" The Reverend finally looked up. "Because suspicion is not sin. And in Flaxborough, we've never prosecuted for heartbreak." Purbright gave a slight smile. "Perhaps we should." "Wouldn't leave many in the pews." He was quiet a moment, then added, "She came to me once. Asked for guidance. Didn't say names, but I knew." "What did you tell her?" "To forgive." "And do you think she did?" Hargreaves lowered the shears. "I think she forgave everyone but herself." On his way home, Purbright passed the assembly rooms. They were already being prepared for the next event. The Garden Society's autumn lecture. A banner fluttered uncertainly from the lintel. The Secret Life of Dahlias. He paused. The door was ajar. Inside, 2 young women were sweeping the floor and laughing quietly over someone's misstep during the wedding dance. In the far corner, where Bernard Bright had once stood speaking about civic duty and decency and how sherry should always be diluted, the microphone stood waiting. Harmless now. Purbright walked to the fire door, the one where the scarf had been found. He opened it, looked down the alley. Nothing, not even an echo of a whistle. But he stood there a moment longer, just in case. That night at the station, Sergeant Love brought in the final file. "Miss Cribbs's statement is complete," he said. "She's requesting legal counsel." "She'll get it." "And the press?" "None, if I can help it." "Do you think she'll talk at the trial?" Purbright considered it. "Number I think she said everything she came here to say." He took the file, skimmed it, paused. Inside, clipped to the final page, was a letter, handwritten in careful, looping script. "Dear Inspector, thank you for finding me. I thought no one ever would. You were kind in how you did it. You saw more than I wanted you to. I hope you forget me soon, but not completely. I'd like to think someone remembers the day I mattered. Yours sincerely, M.C. Purbright." Read it twice, then, very slowly, folded it back into the file. "Sir," Love asked softly. "I need some air," Purbright said. Outside, the town was still. The lamp-posts flickered to life, one by one, as if the streets were taking turns remembering how to glow. Purbright walked with no aim, no hurry. Past the green, past the bakers, past the Sycamore guest house, where Mrs. Callow now slept without suspicion, but not without bitterness. He paused at the corner where Lydia and Alan had once stood, waving to guests, pretending it was the beginning of something. He thought of the wing-back chair, the folded hands, the lie told in silence. He thought of all the performances people gave, the French accent, the modest smile, the perfect marriage, and how sometimes the most dangerous roles weren't the loud ones, but the quiet ones that no one cast. He returned to the station just after midnight, filed the last report, turned off the lamp, and, just before closing the door, whispered to no one in particular, "Good night, Miss Cribbs." It was Thursday morning when the letter arrived. Not by courier nor post, but by hand, slipped discreetly beneath the station door. The envelope was pale cream, unmarked save for a single word written in neat, unfamiliar script. "Inspector." Sergeant Love found it just after 8. He held it between thumb and forefinger like something possibly dangerous, possibly disappointing. Purbright read it once, then again. There were no threats, no apologies, no confessions, only a suggestion. "You should speak to the man who certified the death. He knows what time it really happened." There was no signature. At 9:30, Inspector Purbright walked through the side entrance of the Flaxborough General Practice. The waiting room was filled with people pretending not to mind being ignored. A cough here, a creak of a magazine page there. Dr. Ezra Moxby was seated behind the reception desk, frowning at a clipboard as though it had personally offended him. "Ah," he said, looking up. "Inspector." "Doctor." They exchanged nods. "I'd like a word," Purbright said. "Of course," Moxby replied. "In the back. Surgery 2 is free." The office was clean, overlit, and smelled faintly of plasters and coffee. Moxby sat, folded his hands on the desk, and gave a small sigh. "This is about Bernard, isn't it?" "It is. I already signed the death certificate." "I know, but I don't believe the time was right." Moxby blinked. Purbright continued. "You declared the death at 7:20 a.m., after Mrs. Breeze found him and called the station. You said he'd been dead for several hours." "Yes, likely between 1 and 4 a.m. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "That's not what you wrote." Moxby hesitated. "I adjusted it." "Why?" The doctor looked down at his hands. "Because I was told to." Purbright didn't move. "By whom?" "Reverend Hargreaves." The next hour passed slowly. Moxby explained the Reverend had called him directly, not after the body was found, but before. At 6:05 a.m. to be exact. Said he had been out walking, had passed the inn, and had seen the light on in the upstairs room. Curious, he knocked. No answer. Alarmed, he asked Moxby to check. But the strange part wasn't the early concern. It was the wording. "You'll find him sitting, not lying, and you'll need to bring gloves." Moxby thought it odd at the time, but the Reverend's voice had sounded calm, steady. And when the doctor arrived, Bernard was precisely as described. Seated, composed, quiet as a confession. He had, Moxby now admitted, adjusted the time of death at the Reverend's urging. So the scene would cause less upset. Purbright thanked him and left. He found Reverend Hargreaves in the churchyard, straightening hymnals under a sullen sky. "Reverend," Purbright said softly, "we need to talk." The vicar turned, not startled. "Of course." Inside the vestry, the air was cool and smelled of wood polish and old paper. "I visited Dr. Moxby," Purbright began. "Ah," the Reverend nodded. "You lied." Hargreaves sat quietly on the edge of a wooden pew. "I delayed the truth," he said, "to protect the living." "That's not your decision." "No," Hargreaves agreed. "But you must understand, Bernard was a man of many opinions, strong ones. His death, placed too early, would have implicated the wrong people." "It did implicate the wrong people." "Yes," the Reverend said, "and you're the one who corrected that." "Why didn't you tell us you found him?" "Because I didn't find him. I knew he was there." Purbright leaned forward. "Explain." Hargreaves stared at the floor. "He told me, the night before. He said he was going to write Alan out of everything. Said he'd let the marriage proceed, but that the cottage, the money, would all be revoked. That Lydia's mother was a dangerous influence. That Alan had disappointed him. He planned to rewrite the will? Yes, he said he'd meet with me in the morning. Wanted to run it by God first, as he put it. Purbright said nothing. "I arrived at dawn," the Reverend went on, "to try and reason with him, to tell him perhaps he should forgive instead of punish. But when I got there, the door was ajar, and he was already dead." "So you staged it?" "No," Hargreaves said softly. "Someone already had." The silence between them stretched like winter light. Purbright believed him, not entirely, but enough. The Reverend had lied about the time, but not to conceal a crime, to redirect it, away from Alan, away from the family, away from a scandal that would drown the parish. He had protected the wrong people, perhaps, but not for the wrong reasons. Back at the station, Purbright opened a new folder. Inside, a copy of the guest book, the scarf, the lipstick, the photo from the legal conference, and one final report. Returned that morning from the forensics lab in Lincoln. The wine glass had been cleaned, yes, but inside the tiny grooves of the stem, a trace amount of residue remained. Not poison, something else. Digitalis, a cardiac glycoside, fatal in moderate doses, tasteless in wine, and not easily acquired, unless one had access to medicinal plants, like, say, someone in the Garden Society. Purbright opened a directory, found the number, dialed. "Hello?" said a voice on the other end. "This is Inspector Purbright. May I speak with Mr. Theodore Breese?" The voice hesitated. "Speaking. I believe you grow foxglove." Pause. "I grow many things, Inspector." "Yes, but only one of them can stop a man's heart." Another silence. Then, "You'd better come round." The Breese residence was tucked behind the inn. Mr. Breese, husband to the innkeeper, was a quiet man. In fact, until now, no one had remembered he existed. His wife was far more vivid. But he had been there all along, gardening, listening. He served tea, with trembling hands. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said. "I just wanted him to know." "Know what?" "That we saw what he did. To Alan, to his own brother years ago, the cruelty, the manipulation, it never ended." "So you slipped it in the bottle?" "Number the glass." "The bottle wasn't opened until later. But I handle the glasses. I do the washing. My wife doesn't know. She thinks I polish furniture for a living." Purbright nodded. "And when you heard Miss Cribbs had staged the scene?" "I was relieved," Breese whispered, "because it meant no one would look at me." "And why speak now?" "Because someone else is in a cell, and she was only trying to help." Purbright returned to the station as the street lamps flickered on. He handed the report to Love. "Charge Mr. Breese." "And Miss Cribbs?" "Charge her with obstruction. Nothing more." Love frowned. "You really think he did it?" "I think," Purbright said softly, "that he was the only person Bernard Bright never bothered to notice." He paused at his desk, "And that's exactly who kills you in the end." That night, the town of Flaxborough returned to its routines. The church bell rang at 6, the pub closed at 10, and in the small room behind the inn, Theodore Breese sat, staring at his hands, the same hands that had poured the wine. Quiet, unnoticed, and elsewhere, in a cell where the light was gentler than it needed to be, Miss Cribbs lay on a narrow bed, not crying, not speaking, just waiting. Not for freedom, but for quiet. Real quiet, the kind that didn't need to wear lipstick or leave scarves behind. Inspector Purbright lit his desk lamp one last time that evening and made a note. The truth was not loud. It waited, in the hands of a man no one saw, and a woman everyone forgot. The trial, when it came, was quiet. There were no newspaper headlines. No reporters in trench coats, no photographers loitering by the council flower beds hoping for a shot of Flaxborough's most invisible woman. The court proceedings were conducted in Lincoln, and Miss Cribbs, true to form, neither wept nor spoke out of turn. She answered questions directly, offered no defense beyond truth, and accepted the lesser charge of obstruction with the same crisp politeness she once used to schedule sandwich luncheons. The real murderer, Theodore Breese, pleaded guilty after a single hour of questioning. He explained, without bravado or panic, how he had prepared the wine glass using a few dried foxglove petals ground into powder, hidden in a pouch in his gardening apron. "I didn't mean to kill him," he repeated, "just to weaken him, to make him listen for once." But Bernard Bright hadn't listened. He had died, alone, with a stranger's lipstick on his lips, and the town's illusions still intact. By the end of the week, Mrs. Breese had put the 3 Bells Inn up for sale. Purbright didn't attend the sentencing. There was no need. The case was closed. The town, as it always did, had resumed its walk. Same steps, same smiles. Just fewer names spoken, but even so, something had shifted. Not in noise, but in weight, like an attic that had been cleared. Like a room that still held a smell. He sat now at his desk, finishing the final report. The incident at the wedding reception, death of Bernard Henry Bright, and reading back through the long, typewritten pages with a kind of tired satisfaction. Each chapter of it told a different lie, each one layered like a paper flower. The forged guest book, the false name, the lipstick, the scarf, the French cigarettes, the assumption, shared by so many, that guilt was theatrical. But guilt, as it turned out, was quiet. It lived behind a hedge. It polished the bar, it folded towels and mopped floors and made you a cup of tea while you bled from the inside. Sergeant Love entered, holding a manila envelope. "From Lydia," he said. Purbright raised an eyebrow. Love set it down on the desk and left. Purbright opened the envelope. Inside was a single-page letter. "Dear Inspector Purbright, I've gone. Not far, just away. I've taken a room in Norwich and found a job at a bookshop that smells like old weather. Alan and I are not speaking, though we haven't formally. Separated. I think silence, for now, is our form of honesty. I wanted to thank you, not for solving the case, though I'm grateful for that, but for seeing me. Not as a bride or a daughter, but as someone who had no stage to stand on and still tried to remain upright. I'll come back someday. Perhaps when the leaves change. Perhaps when the next wedding doesn't end with tea and handcuffs. Yours sincerely, Lydia Bright, née Callot." He read it twice, folded it, slid it into a drawer that contained no official forms. By afternoon, the paperwork was done. There were no more suspects to question, no more allies to disarm, just the residue of it all, like the scent that clings to a room long after a guest has gone. He stood, stretched, and wandered down the corridor, where a new temporary secretary, Miss Willerton, all nerves and errant commas, was still learning to type without whispering. He paused. "Miss Willerton." She jumped. "Yes, sir?" "Do you know how to brew proper tea?" I believe so." "Good," he said. Then don't. It only invites disappointment." He moved on, smiling faintly. Outside, the town was shifting into late autumn. The green had gone to rust, the shop windows now featured pumpkins, and the assembly rooms were being prepared for a talk on Victorian undergarments, part of the Historical Curiosities series chaired by Mrs. Royal, who had developed a scholarly interest in petticoats. He passed the florist, where Miss Chubble was arranging chrysanthemums with an expression of near religious importance. "You'll be wanting white for remembrance," she said, without looking up. "Something quieter, perhaps," Purbright replied. "Then lavender. That's the flower of forgiveness, or gossip. It depends how you grow it." He turned onto Wisteria Lane. The cottage was no longer under dispute. The sale had been halted. The title returned to the estate. Alan Bright had relinquished his claim and returned to a flat above the co-op, where he'd reportedly taken up the accordion. The house sat empty now. Curtains drawn. Quiet. Purbright stood at the gate for a long moment, then moved on. By dusk, he was home. The kettle was hot, the biscuit tin full, the wireless murmuring something about a by-election in Northumberland. He sat in his armchair, not a wingback, and stared at nothing in particular. He thought of Miss Cribbs, not the crime, but the waiting, the long years of being unspoken, her entire life folded neatly behind someone else's narrative. And he thought of Bernard Bright, respected, feared, never doubted, which Purbright thought was exactly the problem. He reached for a pen, opened his journal, wrote one final line beneath the day's entry: "Respect is not a defense, nor is silence. We expect murder to shout, but often it sighs." He closed the book, stared out the window where the lamplight softened everything, then turned out the light, and let the town at last sleep.